So thank you all so much for joining today's Co-opting AI event on this beautiful Thursday afternoon. It's beautiful and sunny here in Charlottesville. My name is Sloane. I am a sociologist of artificial intelligence, and I'm the host of the Co-opting AI series, which is a public speaker series on all things artificial intelligence and society. And we've been running since 2019, so pre-pandemic, feels like in another life. I'm an assistant professor of data science and media studies at the University of Virginia, and I am also a fellow with the NYU Institute for Public Knowledge, who are co-hosting the Co-opting AI series. Now, our conversation today is a topic that probably has crossed most of your minds at some point already, which is the intersection of artificial intelligence and political campaigning. Here in the US, we are gearing up for the presidential election, and of course, the arrival of generative AI and large language models begs the question how political campaigning will unfold with technologies readily available that can imitate candidates or write speeches and many other things. I am particularly pleased to host two experts on this topic who can shed light on this question and many other important questions. Hosting today, I am Cody Bontain and Bertrall Ross. Thank you for being here. Much appreciated. Also, a big thanks to the Co-opting AI supporters, the Karsh Institute of Democracy at UVA and the NYU Institute for Public Knowledge, and all the wonderful staff and faculty who helped make this series such a success. Now, before we begin, I want to underline that here at UVA, we acknowledge that the land we learn and work on is the homeland and traditional territory of the Monacan Indian Nation. We pay respect to their elders and knowledge keepers, past and present. We also acknowledge and pay respect to the enslaved Africans, enslaved laborers, and free Black laborers who built the University of Virginia, as well as their descendants. Now, today we want to ask, what are the roles data-driven systems and AI play in political campaigning and the democratic process at large, especially in the context of the US 24 presidential election? So here we are really sort of entering a hot phase in the US, if you will. And as that phase begins at the dawn of a, provocatively put, new age of generative AI, all the new questions around the benefits and risk of using technology and mass media for political messaging arise. Today, it seems AI is everywhere, and the political landscape is no exception. AI can do many things today. It is used to create messages. It is playing a role in fundraising, solicitation. It is playing a role in the emails that you may get from candidates, but is also used to attack political opponents or to even create something like digital twins. You may have heard of that as well. Our panelists will talk more about that today. In the US, regulators are taking steps. There are a couple of states who have already crafted and some have passed legislation that actually addresses the use of AI, and particularly generative AI, in the context of elections. So it's a very dynamic field. And I'm so pleased to be welcoming my two guests today. Starting us off will be Cody Bontain from the University of Maryland, where he is an assistant professor in the College of Information Studies. He is also a research affiliate at NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. Cody studies online information and social media and how we use these spaces during crises and times of political unrest. His focus is on improving information quality, preventing manipulation, and enhancing resilience in online spaces so that these spaces may serve to bring us together and keep us informed rather than driving us apart and opening us up to harm. His work focuses on social media use in conflict spaces, emerging areas of influence, and the use of visual media in online political engagement and manipulation. Other studies he's conducted include the role of recommendation systems as a method of content moderation and its effect across multiple online spaces, as well as the impact of deplatforming on information and engagement quality online. So he's busy. His work has also been featured in important outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired, and others. Cody, thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mona. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me pop up my screen. All right, excellent. Hopefully everybody sees a nice black screen here, right? So I am going to talk about a number of things around online campaigning, AI, and what their role is, a lot around incentives. So we'll sort of go, like, zoom out and then zoom back in on some of these points. Because the main point that I want to make here is that AI and AI systems mediate a great deal of the content that we consume, right? So places like YouTube, online information places, or online information spaces are pretty clear about this, that recommendation systems, these AI-driven systems that decide what kind of content to show you next, drive a significant amount of the viewership on YouTube as a platform. And this is not at all specific to YouTube. We have this in TikTok where people engage with these algorithms and the AI systems that determine what to show you next. And these systems work so well that there's this uncanny concern that they're listening to you, they're reading your mind. These kinds of questions emerge, and not only about how this content gets pushed to you, but also how content creators engage with these systems and create this feedback loop of not just the content that gets shown to you, but the content that gets created. If you're a content creator, you're trying to make content and make money, you want to create content that these systems, these AI systems, are going to push to your audiences. Likewise, if you're creating political campaign, or if you're working political campaigns, you want to create ads, you want to reach your audiences, you're going to create ads, you're going to create marketing material, campaign material that's going to benefit from these systems, right? You want to use these systems to help amplify your message. And we can see evidence of this sort of feedback loop between content creation and AI systems that's been around for 10 years, right? So a paper about going down the rabbit hole about how recommendation systems, especially on YouTube back in the mid-2010s, amplified a particular kind of extremist content. And concerns about this, or work around this, drove studies about the supply and demand effects of right-wing YouTube, and then some work of mine showing that when YouTube changed the way the recommendation systems it was building worked in terms of de-recommending but not removing specific kinds of misinforming and potentially harmful content, this changes the incentives of these platforms and the kind of content that gets created. And that has major implications for how we engage with these spaces, how we are informed, and how campaigns, political campaigns, reach out to us. So Mona mentioned this in my bio. My big thing now is that AI and these online social spaces have the potential to connect us, and they have the potential to keep us better informed. And we can pretty clearly say these systems and these spaces are not living up to that potential. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us as the public? What does that mean for campaign operatives? What does that mean for the United States in the 2024 election? And certainly elections worldwide, right? So colleagues of mine in elections in Argentina that just happened, Brazilian elections that are coming up, et cetera. All of these spaces are influenced by and subject to this kind of technology, right? So briefly, I want to talk about 3 areas of this. This is an AI-generated image about the pros and cons, or evils and goods of AI. This was the first prompt I gave it, and this was a really unsettling image that came up for me, but I was sort of taken by it. Talk briefly about how campaigns leverage this technology, what this means for the general public, and what the incentives are in this technology, right? So first, about campaigns. Certainly AI can enable pro-social activities in these campaigns. So AI allows us to do rapid sort of cross-language translation, which brings more people into the audiences of these messages. And that's really valuable. You can go to ChatGPT right now and ask questions about, given the research on these particular audiences, what are the major concerns about, say, Spanish-speaking Americans? And we know, so from work on COVID, that public health messaging tended to miss the sort of major concerns about minority populations. And if we had technology like ChatGPT or generative AI that helped us better synthesize and understand what the needs are of these audiences, that's potentially useful if you buy that AI, generative AI, actually can, accurately recover your concerns. We also have things that allow us to generate content much more specific or much more targeted to these kinds of audiences, right? So we can have a ChatGPT generated image like this, and then ask it to better target that image for a particular audience. And that's potentially a pro-social, useful kind of marketing capability for campaigns to leverage, especially in the world where in 2024, a lot of what we think is going to be the major drivers of how this election shakes out are Americans who generally don't vote. How do you reach out to those audiences that have traditionally not been included, right? But certainly we can point to other anti-social activities that AI enables. So certainly that these deep fakes and robocalls that are, pretending to be President Biden, basically telling you not to go out and vote, to concerns around deep fake imagery that's being used for very unsettling and uncomfortable kinds of content generation. So I don't want to talk too much about those. We can speculate all kinds of ways about the clearly bad things that AI does. But more interestingly is that these questionable activities are things we don't really know what to deal with, right? So a recent paper came out showing that campaigns are using these AI systems basically to experiment at scale to determine what kind of ads really work for getting their message across and manipulating and influencing you, right? Now that's in some sense maybe not terrible. That's what marketing ads are supposed to do. But do we really want to be subjects of experimentation? And if you are a much more well-resourced campaign that gives you more opportunity to run these experiments and this sort of concentrates power, right? Maybe we're not comfortable with that. Some similar work about the welfare effects of social media have shown that people who were paid to stay off of Facebook reported higher incidence of well-being. So that's bad for social media. People who weren't on social media were happier. But people who were on social media reported being more politically informed, right? So there's a balance here that we have to strike. So it's not about what we enable alone. Also, it's about the kind of incentives that these systems create. So there was this concern in the late 2010s about a change to Facebook's systems and what its platforms were incentivizing or responding to, created a world where Polish politicians had to be more negative, had to be more angry to basically compete in these spaces because Facebook made a change to their algorithms. And there's lots of evidence that basically if you say terrible things about the other side, the political outgroup, you benefit from these platforms sort of amplification, right? So that sort of incentivizes the creation of ads that are going to say terrible things and be very negative. And that's probably not what we want. So what does this mean for us? It means that platforms and AI in particular are very good at helping push content to you through targeted ads, through incentives on the kind of content that's created, agenda setting questions about, well, what kind of news is news that's going to get a lot of traction? And then, of course, this creation of exploitive and manipulative content, right? So these platforms and AI systems are very good at pushing kinds of content to you that you're likely to engage with. So we really shouldn't rely just on what's pushed to us, because the research shows we're actually quite good at pulling content that's less sort of influenced by this. The role of AI in the content that we're actively seeking isn't as large. Because if you're going to search engines, you're looking for content, you are politically engaged, then the choice of search terms you use actually has way more impact than these questions of personalization. Certainly, there's a feedback loop here, though, because the kind of content that's being produced is driven by or is mediated by these AI systems, and then the kind of content we're exposed to is an outcome of what is being amplified by these systems. So our selection of keywords and what we're going to search for is itself sort of part of this system, right? So there's good evidence that sort of exposure to your friends and audiences on social media through AI systems exposes you to cross-cutting sort of counter-ideological content, which is probably a good thing. But it's really difficult to disentangle this feedback loop between AI systems, social media platforms, recommendation, and the kind of information that we care about, right? So what are the incentives here? Well, I think a bigger question is what behaviors should AI systems be incentivizing, especially in the context of political campaigns? We can say these kinds of clearly negative antisocial behaviors are things we want to avoid. They can be, clear targets for regulation, right? So we can be pretty clear about that. But the concern here is deep fakes, this kind of threat, are actually not really existential threats in the sort of way that they're made out to be. This piece of research from the Rand Corporation basically shows its major thesis is people are very good at identifying fakes, and that's not really the concern. And there's certainly pro-social things that we can incentivize, right? So this cross-cutting exposure, that's a useful thing. There's some really great work from Nela Asimovich, who was at NYU and now is going to be at Georgetown, showing that Facebook activity was correlated with pro-social, better feeling about the ethnic outgroup in ethnically polarized settings. That's a useful sort of outcome, right? This social media use potentially decreases ethnic polarization. These are good things. But these questions about enabling large-scale experimentation, algorithmic amplification of politics, are those good things? Do we want our algorithms to be pushing politics to us, knowing that there's possibilities for impacts on your welfare? These are concerns that we don't have good answers for. Now, the real question about these is who gets to decide, who is deciding what these incentives are and what sort of technology is being enabled by these systems. And I'll tell you, where these decisions are being made looks way more like this than it does like this. And that's a concern, right? If these decisions are being made by boardrooms, corporate boardrooms, or engineering boards, and we're asking them to create content for us, are we going to be in a world where they're creating content that we know we're going to interact with? Like if you ask an addict, what's the thing that you want right now? What's this thing that you're likely going to buy? Maybe it's another drink. Maybe it's another thing that we're going to engage with. Maybe it's another terrible or angry message about the outgroup. And that's not really what we want if we were to ask, do you want to be an addict? Do you want to be exposed to lots of angry content? So who gets to decide? And this is a socio-technical question. This should be decided in a larger space. Right? If we want to co-opt AI into a force that better connects us and better informs us, these decision-making processes don't need to be in those or relegated to those corporate boardrooms and engineering departments. They need to be in more public spaces. So that's where I'll end my provocation now. So thanks very much. I'm really excited to talk about this more.
Thank you so much, Cody. Much appreciated. Wonderful provocations, plural in there, that I'm very excited to talk about a little later. I'm also excited that we have Bertrall Ross with us now, who is our second panelist. So following Cody's provocations will be Bertrall, who is a professor of law here at the University of Virginia School of Law. He's also a co-director at the Karsh Center for Law and Democracy, and the founder of the Designing Democracy project. So apropos, what kinds of decisions do we make about how we get informed, right? Bertrall teaches and writes in the area of constitutional law, constitutional theory, election law, administrative law, and statutory interpretation. His work is driven by a concern about democratic responsiveness and accountability, as well as the inclusion of marginalized communities in administrative and political processes. His past scholarship has been published in several books and journals, and 2 of his articles were selected by the Yale/Harvard/Stanford Junior Faculty Forum. Before he came to us at UVA, he taught at the University of California at Berkeley School of Law, where he received the Rutter Award for teaching excellence. He's also been awarded other awards, such as the Berlin Prize from the American Academy in Berlin, the Princeton University Law and Public Affairs Fellowship, and the Columbia Law School Kellis Parker Academic Fellowship, and many others. He is currently serving on the Administrative Conference of the United States and the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. He got his undergraduate in International Affairs and History from the University of Colorado, Boulder, and his graduate degrees from the Sloane School of Economics, like me, and Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. His law degree is from Yale. He has also clerked for Judge Dorothy Nelson of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and Judge Myron Thompson of the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Alabama. Welcome, Bertrall. I'm glad you made it. Thank you for coming, and over to you. But before you go, just a note for our audience members, as per usual, as you hear the wonderful provocations and thoughts from our panelists, do put your questions into the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will pick those up a little later. Okay, Bertrall, over to you.
All right, thanks, Mona. I'm probably very much misplaced in a panel that involves technology, given my ineptitude when it comes to technology. I apologize for being late. Zoom gave me a problem, but I am at last here, and I'm glad to be joining all of you and glad to be here with Cody. Sorry, I only saw the latter half of your presentation, but I'm looking forward to having a broader conversation. As Mona says, I'm a scholar of law and democracy. My focus is very much on law and inequality. And a couple of the more recent projects have been focused on the participation gap between the wealthy and the poor. Now, we might think of this participation gap as being a problem that's primarily experienced by those who do not vote. If you don't vote, you're not likely to be represented. So to the extent that low-income individuals are not voting, that's a problem for them to have to deal with. And the underrepresentation that associated with that seems like a group-based problem. But I would suggest, as one of my provocations, that this is a social problem as well, that marginalization, alienation has cost to all of us. And the cost is the threats that such marginalization and alienation poses for our democratic system. When you have a group of individuals in a society that are marginalized and alienated, they are ripe for recruitment by anti-democratic and authoritarian forces. And so it's up to us all as a society to make sure those that are marginalized can be engaged in the political process. And so I see technology as potentially a part of the answer, maybe. I don't know, maybe part of the problem. I don't know. It depends on how it's used. And I'll just kind of point out a couple of things related to technology that's most relevant to my work that I engage in, which is focusing on how campaigns decide who to contact during election season. Okay, so let me kind of put my PowerPoint slideshow up for all of you. I guess I'll go back to the beginning, right? Okay, so my starting point is this participation gap. And Matthew Polacco, in an article that was recently written, 2022, I believe, provides a comparative assessment of the participation gap between the wealthy and the poor. And you see the United States stands heads above everyone else. It's a sort of American exceptionalism that perhaps we do not want to claim, but it's one that belongs to us nonetheless. Here's kind of a graph that tells you about the income gap between the highest and lowest income quintiles, or turnout gap, excuse me, between the highest and lowest income quintiles between 1964 and 2012. And I can tell you, although this graph has not been updated, that those numbers with respect to the 30% turnout gap and above have continued through the 2016 and 2020 election. So while there's a lot of focus, appropriately so, on the racial turnout gap and the role of the Voting Rights Act in ameliorating that gap, what has persisted ever since numbers were recorded on the turnout gap between the wealthy and the poor is this persistent turnout gap between the groups. Now, what's the source of this turnout gap? Well, there's a lot of different sources that you can point to. There's huge disparities in education between lower income and higher income individuals. And that difference in education can create disparities in the capacity of individuals to obtain and process information relevant to campaigns. What Anthony Downs and his seminal political economy work from the 1960s pointed out was that we may focus a lot on these tangible barriers and costs to voting, such as voter ID laws, which is something that's in the news quite a bit. But what he pointed out was that information is a key variable in the decision of an individual to vote. Information is key for individuals to understand the benefits from voting. It helps them to differentiate between one candidate and the other in terms of their own well-being. Information is also critical in the logistics of voting. Information about how, where, and when to vote is critical to getting people to the polls. And so if you combine sort of education, processing, and obtaining information, that is a major contributor. There are other contributors that have to do with respect to the uniqueness of American law. In many states, persons with felony convictions, even when they're finished with their prison terms, are subject to disfranchisement. And so the exclusion of those class of individuals who tend to be low income because of employment barriers that they face after they've served their terms is another contributing factor. And then there's contributing factors with respect to habits and connections with the voting process that arise from family circumstances. But the one I've been most interested in is the information component. And to imagine that we'll be able to change the education system to make it fair and equal in any short amount of time is probably foolish, although I wish that to be. But there's another source of information that can ameliorate the gap between wealthy and poor voting. And one of the information source I've been really focused on is the information provided by campaigns. So campaigns engage during election season in various forms of outreach. And three of the most prominent forms of outreach include sending mailers to voters that usually has a candidate's picture or name and perhaps some things that that candidate stands for. Perhaps there are phone calls that are made to individuals over the phone that describe the candidate, perhaps describe the other candidate in more negative terms, perhaps have information about, or share information about where and how to vote. And then there's knocking on people's door, the sort of shoe grease that's attained in the canvassing process. And once you knock on the individual's door and you share information about the candidates and about how to vote. Now, what was shown in the series of studies that began in the 1990s with unions doing experiments and then ultimately political scientists picking this up in the 2000s and going forward is that that latter form of contact and engagement, knocking on people's doors, has a tremendous impact on voting. Studies have found that the voting turnout increases by somewhere around 8 to 10%. If a person is contacted. In other words, a person that's contacted is 8 to 10% more likely to vote than a person that's not contacted. That's a huge result. If you want to sort of think about the comparison, there are many studies on voter ID laws. And what's been shown is that those have a statistically negligible impact on turnout. So whereas much of the focus in law and in other places is on these tangible barriers to voting, it's information that does a lot of it's these contacts and the contacts and what they provide, which is both a sense of engagement and information that has proven quite important. So how does this play into the turnout gap? Well, it plays into the turnout gap and then plays ultimately into technology and the potential for artificial intelligence in this way. Now, these are two sets of numbers. They're drawn from different sources because the ANES, the American National Election Study, stopped collecting this information at a certain point, and the CCES, a Cooperative Congressional Election Study, started to collect this information at a particular point. And what's important to note is what the point the point estimates are the gap in turnout between, or gap in contact between the wealthy and the poor. And this is based on surveys of individuals asking whether they were contacted by a campaign during election season. And we see that this contact gap between the wealthy and the poor has existed since these numbers were recorded in the late 70s. But what we see here is that that contact gap has increased over time, and in particularly with recent elections. So what's going on in these recent elections? Well, we're seeing campaigns rely a lot more on algorithms and digital technology to obtain information about voters. And there are two bits of information that they're most curious about. The first bit is their past voting behavior. have they voted in past election, and how frequently have they voted in past election. And the second piece of information is, some indicator of how they might vote based on some indicator of preferences that might align with one party or the other. Now, what's proven most important of those two bits of information has really been past voting behavior. And what we see is that campaigns relying on that information about past voting behavior to inform their decisions on who to contact. Because studies have shown that it's harder to get those who have not voted in past elections to vote in the current election, that it requires more than just a simple one-door knock and providing them with a script. It often requires repeated contacts. It often requires that you obtain or get someone from their community to contact them, someone that they would trust and such. And those add expenses and time to the campaign that they do not want to incur. So what technology has done is allow campaigns to be more precise in identifying both those who are likely to vote and likely to vote favorable to them, and those who are less likely to vote and unfavorably to them. And we see this kind of increase in sophistication by just comparing the contact decisions by 3 Democratic campaigns over a 3-year period, over 3 election cycles. And this is the sort of presidential campaigns that were associated with John Kerry in 2004, and this is in Ohio, and then President Obama in 2008, and then President Obama again in 2012. And what we're looking for here is really focusing on the y-axis. And the y-axis, as you go from top to bottom, focuses on from low turnout individuals to high turnout individuals. And what the heat map means is the redder the heat is, the less likely those individuals have been contacted, right? And so we see that there has been a rather consistent pattern over these 3 elections with respect to contacting less contact of low-income individuals. But it was a bit more sporadic in 2004. And then you look at the x-axis, you're looking at it goes from Republican leaning to Democrat leaning, that at least with respect to Democratic leaning low turnout voters, there was rather high levels of turnout. And it seemed that turnout really turned almost as much on partisan leaning as it did on income. And so this Democratic campaign in 2004 is less likely to contact Republicans, whether you're high or low past turnout, and they're more likely to contact Democratic leaning voters. In 2008, we start to see a bit of a shift in the pattern. There's still much less contact of Republican voters, as you might expect from a Democratic campaign, but you start to see a clustering of non-contact centering on low turnout voters. There's still somewhat of a willingness to contact low-income Democratic-leaning voters, but it's even a little bit lighter in terms of yellow as opposed to the green we see in the first. And then we get to the third, and we see the sophistication with the use of information and data gathering tools and construction of algorithms through forms of micro-targeting. And who is paying the cost in terms of contact? Well, it's those low-income voters. And so the low-income voters are the category of voters that are consistently not contacted, irrespective of their partisan leaning, right? And we don't have this heat map for 2016 and 2020, of course, but one could suspect, based on the prior graph in terms of the increase in the turnout gap, that heat map pattern has persisted and has gotten worse over time. And so my provocation is really, what can AI do anything about this particular problem? And which way might it go? Now, one thing I can imagine is AI doing the following work. Now, I'm not a tech guy, I'm a law guy. And so this may be outside of the realm of what is feasible or possible. But this is sort of a thought process, right? In terms of if AI could do this, would it help? So imagine a person could enter background information about their neighborhood, income, number, and age of their children, their use of public schools, and a computer program powered by artificial intelligence could tell them the impact of the city's budgetary law or a city council's candidate's budgetary proposal on the quality of their children's education. The program could tell them the degree and probability of teacher turnover, any change in student-teacher ratios, the impact on the safety of the school, and probable changes in the percent of students who will graduate on time and attend college. The person could then use that information to decide whether to support the challenger in his proposed budget or stick with the incumbent who voted for the city council's budget. Now, one piece of pushback, other than the technological feasibility of this particular idea, is how often would voters actually use it, right? And I'm not particularly sanguine in thinking that voters would, and particularly those who have not turned out all that frequently in the past, would run to this program and use it in making their calculations about whether and how to vote. Many of these individuals feel so disaffected from politics that they don't think their vote would matter, no matter what. But one thing it could help do is that to the extent that it can inform campaigns more about, how their programs and how their policy proposals impact particular communities, and impact particular communities that are fall in the low income non-voting scale. Maybe it could provide the right set of incentives and the right set of tools that they can use when they're contacting these individuals. So rather than reading these individuals a script about how this campaign would work for them and all these other things that campaigns do, what the campaign can do using this information is explain to the individual how their programs would impact their lives in very concrete ways. And I think that that information, or they could tell them about how their past policies have impacted them in concrete ways, right? I think that that sort of information would be useful to those, even those non-voters, and maybe would get them off the sideline and get them more engaged in politics, and could potentially have a good feedback loop in which their greater involvement in politics will lead to shifts in platform that are more responsive to those low turnout, low income communities. So I'll stop there, and thank you guys for listening to my provocation.
Thank you so much, Bertrall. Much appreciated. If you want to, yes, perfect. Okay. Wow, that's a ton of amazing thoughts that we have here. So, Cody, I really appreciated you sort of juxtaposing things, right? Social, antisocial, push and pull, the sort of dynamics that you see currently in the use of various kinds of AI in the political landscape and in the context of political messaging, really, particularly on social media. And Bertrall, you were equally interested in polarization, right? And gaps, right? The participation gap and the turnout gap and the contact gap, and much appreciated that you brought the wonderful speculative AI proposal to us, which I will get back to. So I have the privilege of asking you both a couple of questions, and then hopefully we will hear from our audience members who I asked to put their questions and comments into the Q&A box, and I will get to those. Now, what struck me was that you both spoke about, in different ways, about technology that should be in the public interest, or about technology as a public interest concern in AI particularly. And that is sort of a field that has been growing in the US for a couple of years now, as a field of research, as a field of activism, and something that some companies are beginning to get interested in, sort of, I think, more on the compliance side of things, perhaps. And so I wonder if you can both speak to that. What would a public interest critique look like of AI in the context of campaigning, in your point of view? And what would a useful avenue look like? Bertrall, you already spoke about that, but maybe you can expand on that. So Cody, I'm gonna toss that question to you first. Public interest technology, a critique of public interest technology at the intersection of AI and political campaigning.
Certainly, there are many examples of how AI, machine learning, these kinds of technologies have been used for social good, right? So I guess for the past almost 15 years now, data science for social good has become increasingly popular, right? At the same time, companies' sort of engagement with this, at least from where I sit, sort of ebbs and flows. I just recently did an interview with one of the University of Maryland pieces about Facebook's 20-year anniversary, right? So Facebook turns 20 this year. And the public sentiment towards Facebook and these sort of platforms and companies and corporations that use AI to determine, what ads you're shown and how people engage with these ads is certainly not as high as it was back in 2010 to 2012, where we saw things like the Arab Spring and President Obama's campaigns really, really engaging with these technologies. I think the public sentiment towards AI, towards online social spaces, what technology could do for us in terms of campaigning, political engagement, was extremely positive. It was a place for people to come together and talk, right? And that's definitely changed over the past 8 years or so. And I'm really interested actually in Bertrall's point about this, like the intersection between how we are determining who's getting these ads, who's getting this kind of content pushed in front of us, and how these algorithms are playing an increasing role in making sure that the ads they are being paid to show are ads that are going to get clicks that people will click on, right? So there's this intersection or interaction between what content's being shown, these algorithms that are making sure that the money you're spending on ads are going to people that are going to engage with those ads, and then people who are low voter turnout populations, right? Like they're not going to engage in those ads maybe by definition, and they're just less likely to be shown them as a result. So there's this whole feedback loop here, and it's not clear what the answer is. But I'm super interested in Bertrall's response.
Yeah, I think Cody hit on sort of the important points there, right? In terms of AI provides an excellent opportunity for precision and targeting, right? And you can really get a sense, through the information that's collected and what you learn about individuals using this technology, about what they might want, what they might be interested in. And that's kind of cool, right? You'd rather have things that are placed in front of you that you might find interesting than not. And I think that's to the extent that knowledge of interests of the people feeds back to the campaign in terms of how they think of themselves and what they should be promoted, and then ultimately feeds back into policy in terms of the policies that should be enacted. That would be a pretty awesome loop, virtuous loop that's being created, at least amongst the attentive public. The concern, of course, as Cody hit on at the end, is that what about the inattentive publics, right? There tends to be perhaps less effort targeting these inattentive publics, at least right now. Maybe that will evolve. These elections are, at least at the presidential level, quite competitive. If we add a degree of competitiveness to lower level elections, then maybe there'd be even more incentives to make those efforts towards inattentive publics and really identifying what their wants and what their needs are and targeting those individuals with greater content. And then you could sort of see that virtuous feedback loop becoming a little bit more inclusive, in which you are starting to incorporate the interests of a broader segment of the American people. And those interests kind of go and feed into the platform and feed into policy. But I don't think we're quite there yet, at least with how campaigns are operating. And I'm curious in terms of where they might go in the future. And I wonder if public policy can be part of the answer in terms of pushing and incentivizing, that more inclusive behavior with the use of technology.
And this is a really hard problem because the current systems benefit certain groups more than others, right? So where does the political will come from? Like, so if you say, well, we want to increase, voter turnout among low income populations, right? The expectation is that's going to benefit Democrats and harm Republicans. So it's very difficult to imagine a world where one particular party is going to take action or push for policy that we know is likely to be hostile to their outcome or to their interests, right? And we see this actually in the online spaces where any sort of choice that a platform takes about content moderation. So there are questions here about questions in the chat about how people or how AI is used, or what are the positive examples here. Any action that these platforms take can be viewed in a like positive light or negative light depending on your political lean, right? So there's lots of work saying, oh, don't do algorithmic amplification or algorithmic personalization at all. But that is in itself an algorithmic approach where it's just it benefits people who are very loud, and it just changes what the benefits are. It doesn't solve these problems, right? So it's unclear what the path forward is.
So I have a maybe a little bit of provocative questions before I will start bringing in questions from the audience, which is both of you sort of have talked about relying on the past for making decisions about political messaging, about including people in the democratic process ultimately, whether that is in the context of pushing ads on social media in an AI-driven way. We just heard about the feedback loop, right? We just talked about it in a positive and maybe negative way. Or Bertrall, you talked about relying on the past voting behavior to really focus on those who are most likely to vote. My question is, if that is the paradigm, right? And as a sociologist, I'm sort of interested in what are the bigger sort of narratives and dynamics here at play. If that is the paradigm, sort of a commitment to the past and a real expensive effort to rely on that data, on that knowledge for mobilizing people, where is there space for, or is there space for unconventional ideas, radical ideas, ideas that don't have a connective tissue necessarily to the past? Is there in our AI infused campaigning political messaging world, is there a place for that if the paradigm is about relying on the past to make predictions about the future? Cody and Bertrall, maybe you could comment on that, and then we'll turn to our audience members.
That was a great question. In my focus on campaigns, they are, inherently conservative, right? They are risk averse, and therefore they tend to want to rely on the tools that they think have worked in the past. And it's particularly challenging, right? Because the past is not necessarily a prediction and a guarantee of what's going to happen in the future. Just because someone hasn't voted in the past doesn't mean that they won't be active participants and great supporters for you in the future. But the wedding to the past is really because you have a lot of data on the past, right? And of course, what they're using this digital data AI for is just to comb all of this data from the past to kind of make some predictions and assessment about the present. I think this is where I feel like there's to move campaigns, it requires some sort of nudge, right? And there are ways in which you can nudge campaign. There are things that states have power over that can perhaps nudge campaigns in particular directions. One of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of the types of nudges that you could give to campaign is, what if you sort of provide them with some sort of reward, right, for engaging in contacts of these other types of communities, using your data and focusing your data on obtaining the information that would lead you to do more work to contact these other individuals that are excluded. What would that reward look like? Well, you can imagine we have this presidential matching fund that basically sits untouched because no presidential campaign in their right mind would ever agree to the conditions that are placed on obtaining these funds, which means you can't raise a certain amount. There's limits on how much you can raise in a presidential campaign. McCain made that move in 2008. And he was obliterated by President Obama's campaign and their fundraising machine. And he was capped with how much he could raise. So there's that money that's just still sitting there. That $3 checkoff that you do on your tax returns or will do on your tax returns over the next couple of years or over the next couple of months, that's going to the fund. So can we imagine that fund being used for putting it to use? And maybe it doesn't work where at the presidential level where they're flooded with money, but maybe at the local level, right? At the local level where you provide the necessary sort of boost to their campaign funding if they engage in productive democratic activity, which involves using sort of technology to obtain information and to contact these individuals that are normally excluded. So maybe those are the types of tools that could nudge to the campaigns to think in more future terms rather than fixating on the past and maintaining the status quo.
I'm really glad that Bertrall brought up this point about the presidential matching funds, because like I see this gap in low and high income touches, and my immediate thought is like, well, in 2008 when Obama chooses not to use the presidential campaigns, like you think about what this advertising is doing. I'm advertising to audiences who are likely to give me money from like to donate to my campaign, right? So that's another possibility about how these advertising models, these that are based on click-through rate and ad performance, are optimizing towards getting your ads in front of someone who's likely to donate to your campaign, and it's not going to be a low-income voter, and it like arguably shouldn't be. As a result, we have basically not touched these state or public funds at all. I'm particularly interested in looking forward to your question, Mona, about where is there space to try something new? And I think it is not at the presidential election level, but at these local elections, local campaigns. There's opportunity there to do something interesting and something valuable, right? And parties exist to get their candidates elected. And I think we'll see these parties or these campaigns move towards what can we do to take advantage of new and possible use cases. So that one of the articles I showed you is, the election in 2024 is going to arguably driven by people who don't generally vote. How do you reach those audiences? We live in a relatively extremely polarized environment. I don't think that's a fault of technology. I think that's a larger question. But if that's the world, where are you going to go to get voters to vote for you? You're going to have to go to people who are not polarized, people who are not polarized, or people who are not engaged in politics, right? So I think there is pressure to like reach out to these audiences.
Thank you, Cody. I'm gonna and thank you, Bertrall, also for this. Much appreciated. I was very happy I could ask that question. Now I will start bringing in our audience members, and I will allocate the questions so we have make the best use of our time together. So Cody, just related to what you just talked about, we have a question which is as follows: how close is AI to pinpointing individuals rather than neighborhoods? For example, can it be used to target the 42K voters who voted for Biden, but if they had voted for Trump in 2020, Trump would have remained president?
This is an interesting question. So certainly AI is very good at targeting, and micro-targeting is a thing that we can do, right? Much of this is based on, the behaviors of you and the people around you, the people who are near to you, social connections, people who are like you. So I think you could probably pinpoint a group, like a small population who behaved this way. The counterfactual, though, is particularly difficult, right? So this goes to this question about the past behavior. All of these AI models are necessarily trained on past behavior. So you could create a world or create an alternative world and say, if we change some of these things, what would that look like? Or what would the world look like? You could do that level of manipulation in the sort of model. And I could see a world where you could target that, like those kinds of people, right? But I don't think it would be down to, oh, it's this particular person with this particular like social security number or something like that. It'd be much more of a segment of the audience. This kind of person who likely lives here, who maybe has this income range and these kinds of interests, right? They search for a lot of politics online, and it's not going to be like you specifically, though the likelihood that it is you is very high, right? But it's not at that level of like this particular person.
Yeah, but that's an interesting and relevant question, right? And post Cambridge Analytica is certainly one that is on everybody's mind. Bertrall, I have one for you. How do you think the potential for disinformation pushed out by generative AI could affect voter turnout, for example, by potentially increasing distrust for marginalized voters? And you see why I gave you that one.
Yeah, and I was trying to paint an optimistic story about the potential for AI, right? We're living in such dark times. We need some light in our life, but that's the real concern I have, right? When you have inattentive and disengaged voters, they're perhaps the most vulnerable to disinformation, right? They're the most vulnerable to accepting facts that just do not comport with reality, to believing things about a candidate that aren't true, and believing things about policies that are not true, which is why I like sort of the idea of some form of verification, right? And so, if we can imagine my sort of AI hypothetical being a reality, it could provide a tool for verification, right? You have someone come to your house and tells you things about what the candidate did that was harmful to you, right? And maybe there could be tools that could be constructed that allows the individual empowered to do that verification. So they may not go to it in a first instance, because even if that program is available, right, they're not necessarily thinking about it, but maybe if they're prompted to engage that program, then they can sort of engage in that verification. And at the very least, it could lead campaigns to be a little more hesitant with disinformation, right? Even if you don't know for sure that that voter will engage in some sort of verification, there's a possibility that if there's a possibility that they could, you might be a little bit more reluctant to spread disinformation, because you may see distrust in you as a campaign and your candidate, in that person and in the networks that that person belongs to. We don't live in isolation. That person that you're contacting will often have a family, will have friends, and to the extent that they are lied to, they will let other people know. And so there could be sort of potential costs for disinformation, but unless there's some sort of verification tool, the concern about disinformation will remain quite high.
Yeah, thank you for that. Lots to grapple with. Cody, I have one for you. And that's a really interesting one that connects to, I think, Bertrall's idea, and I will tell you in a minute why. So we have a question from Joseph, who is asking if you could elaborate on the use of AI in campaigns with regards to translating between languages. Can you say more? Are you referencing a particular program? Are there any substantive examples of that? And I'm gonna top that up with the following, and then maybe Bertrall, you can speak to that. From my own research, I know that generative AI is used, for example, in recruiting to write messages in a tone that is more likely to excite a potential candidate, for example. So that's, one level deeper than just the language. It is about, culture ultimately, right? So I wonder, Cody, if you could elaborate on the language question, give any specific examples, and then Bertrall, if you could maybe play with your idea, your AI idea with regards to sort of milieu-specific generative AI language or tone.
Yeah, I can talk briefly about sort of what I was alluding to there, and the opportunities that exist, right? So this is more than Google Translate. This is actually closer, I think, to what you described, Mona. So rather than just doing translation, right, I can create a message that I think is useful or I think is interesting, or rather, I can create a message that is a good sort of summary of my political platform. And then I could ask and can ask these generative AI systems, help me sort of craft my message or the parts of my platform that are going to resonate most with a particular audience. And then translate that into the language of that audience. And that translation may be cross-language, but it may be cross-cultural as well. ChatGPT, generative AI systems can do that level basically now. And to some degree, that's not a bad thing, right? Like you could imagine really what that is saving a campaign, a political campaign money, where otherwise they would have had to go out and hire somebody who has expertise or experience with that particular audience. And I think that's really valuable because campaigns exist in especially where they're trying to generate all of this fundraising. The more opportunity they have to engage with audiences that generally are unengaged, the better they can craft their message for those audiences. That's I think a pro-social for exactly the reason Bertrall mentions about disinformation. There's lots of studies of disinformation during like the 2016 election that show we got lots of engagement around disinformation, but mostly from people who were already sort of politically motivated and aligned with the messages of those the disinformation narratives. And it was very little, there was very little outcome about change in belief, change in opinion, or changes in voter turnout, right? So I'm not super concerned about the sharing of low quality information or lies. I think that'll be called out quite quickly. So instead it's, is this consistent with the platform of this candidate? I think that's going to be the real question. This platform or this campaign is translated its platform into a version or into a message that's particularly resonant with my audience. Did it get to the point where now it's no longer representing what actually my platform is about? Or it's something that's like eliding a whole bunch of content about how my platform is actually going to harm you, and I'm not going to talk about those things. I'm only going to talk about these things. Those are the concerns I have.
And I think the point that Cody's making about sort of that cultural relevance and connection, and that you raised, Mona, in your question, right? I think that it really reminds me of, what campaigns that have tried to reach out to marginalized communities have had to do, right? And what they have felt, what they have realized is that, sending, the campaigner from the college, the university, 50 miles away, who's young and energetic and excited, but has no connection to the community at all, just does not work, right? What works is if you have members from the community engaging with members of the community. And I think that that is also relevant to the AI connection, right? In terms of there has to be sort of that cultural relevance and competence that's associated with that community, or that cultural connection with that community that will make the tools most effective. And so there's a way in which people speak in different communities that it has to sort of attach to, and the way that people understand language that it will have to attach to. And I think that, as Cody describes, like that technology may already be there and available, and it's really about sort of using the technology as a way to reach communities that feel disaffected, especially when elite campaigns come in with their elite canvassers into their communities in ways that make them feel even more disaffected sometimes.
Yeah, another feedback loop in a way, right? We have one logistical question. Will the transcript be available? Yes, this will go up on YouTube, as per usual, where you can find all of our Co-opting AI events. Now, we have a bunch of questions that I kind of want to combine, and they are about accountability in AI in the context of political campaigning and political messaging. We have one question that is about the degree of personalization permissible in political messaging. So this sort of is related to some thornier issues we've seen in the past, where protected characteristics groups were targeted inadvertently. So what about that? What would auditing what would that type of auditing look like? Cody, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available now. So from the standpoint of political advertising, I actually think much of the targeting capabilities are valuable and useful things. There was a lot of work done in like the 2000s to 2010s about the utility of social media and this sort of online advertising as a way to reduce incumbent advantage. So incumbents have a lot of recognition, they generally win elections, and these campaigns that rely on social media or advertising, AI driven advertising, can reach out to like particular audiences, reduce some of that name recognition by getting their message out there more directly. I think there's value in that. But there is huge difficulty in understanding like how much is being spent, who is engaging with these advertisements, what that looks like. And platforms, at least Metform, is increasingly interested or increasingly supporting researchers' access to political advertising. So Facebook maintains what's called the Facebook Ads Library. It's an international collection of politically relevant ads. There's a lot of difficulty there about how you define politically relevant advertising, though, because in some sense, like the political scientist in me is like, well, everything is political, because any sort of activist content can be political. And are you going to say, well, we're not going to allow personalization about climate change ads to talk about, well, like people who are most affected by climate change or people who care most about climate change, right? I think that's really difficult. Certainly there's a role for auditing, though, and my real question is who is responsible, who takes the authority about what that auditing looks like. Right now it's corporations. There's very little insight from governments and very little political will in the United States to do this.
Yeah, and who pays for audits, right? They can take a long
Yeah.
time. Bertrall, big question for you. What if AI campaign meddling goes sideways? Would legislators act to protect elections?
So that's $1 million question, right? And I guess it depends on the way the election goes, whether how they feel about protecting elections. I think that one of the things that Congress or state legislatures are going to have to puzzle with is how do you effectively protect elections, right? And do these institutions understand technology enough to respond to the problems? I take it back to Cody's picture of the House of Congress, the House of Congress versus the boardroom, right? I think that much of this, in terms of response to the election challenges that AI raises, will have to be in partnership between state lawmakers and the tech companies. And we see some of that collaboration occur. I think too much of it, at least what we see in Congress, is through these hearing formats that aren't that productive. But I know that there are backdoor conversations about what we can do. And there's, groups that are thinking about how to respond to technology's challenges to elections, verified voting. I'm a board member for, and they're constantly thinking through the different sort of obstacles that that technology raises for democracy, for the running of elections. So you have in the system, with respect to things that they've been thinking about with respect to the machines that are responsible for tabulating your votes, right? What's the audit mechanism that's best effective at ensuring that votes are tabulated appropriately and such? For those that are engaging in questions about AI and its influence on perhaps the way that election administrators run their elections, right? Can it be a tool that's useful to election administrators that are very under-resourced, to the extent that it could provide them with the sort of information and perhaps efficiency gains with respect to their jobs that could make elections more effective? But I do worry in terms of, if we get to the point where AI goes sideways and disrupts an election, what the consequences will be, given the manifest distrust we have with respect to elections. And if that AI disrupted technology impacts an election in ways that impacts those who are already quite critical and concerned about the operation of elections, it could represent a threat to the fundamental structure in our democracy, which means it's a threat to democracy itself. So I do have some concerns there.
Yeah, valid ones also. Yeah. We have about 2 minutes left, so I want to begin to close us off, and I'm gonna ask both of our panelists one big question, and I will package some of the questions that are still in the chat into that. So my question for you is, how are you anticipating this big US election year to unfold in 2024? In other words, I'm asking you for your prediction, not who's going to win, but how is AI going to come into the picture? Are we going to see certain groups being more AI aggressive over others? And are we perhaps looking at a future where politicians are getting increasingly disconnected from their constituents? And is the work of being a politician, of enacting democracy, actually changing? So what's ahead of us, Cody?
I am concerned massively about the direction for the election season this year. But I think much of that is not about AI directly, right? AI is a tool in my mind that serves to either alleviate or exacerbate existing social problems. So all the issues around it to me are primarily socio-technical. And the major concern I have is, do companies, do politicians and campaigns have the political will to address head-on concerns about information quality, concerns about anger and hostility and violence? Those are my main concerns, right? You know, around COVID and the 2020 election, platforms, advertising platforms, social media platforms that rely on AI were much more willing to come out and say, we're going to reduce certain kinds of content on our platform or ostensibly around public health, right? It's much easier to make claims around public health and say these are like social good issues than it is about appearing partisan, because anything that you say about content moderation of politicians gets viewed in a political will or in a political light. There was a lot more interest and capability to address concerns and conspiracies around COVID than there was around the election. And my concern is we've lost that. So Twitter, now X, doesn't exist in the same sort of form that it was several years ago. Facebook and Meta maybe are more interested because they are subject to Europe's Digital Services Act. TikTok similarly, right? So what did those platforms do? What do those platforms, or how do those platforms engage with potentially hostile rhetoric? How do the media channels that we consume data from, how do they engage with hostile rhetoric? And I don't know how that's going to go, and that makes me very anxious. But I don't think AI is going to be the major problem there. I think it may serve to make things better, but it may serve equally likely to make things worse.
Like I said, thank goodness for Europe, right? With some sort of limitations that they're placing on digital technology. I think that we were probably, at least for this election, will be in the cycle of campaigns imagining perhaps more destructive uses of AI, right? Uses of AI in ways that can dissuade people from voting, or could, persuade people to vote in misinformed ways, because, that's just, kind of where we are at in the cycle. And I anticipate, probably the Republican Party being a bit more aggressive with the use of AI, because they tend to want to target the, more infrequent voters that might be oriented towards the Democratic Party. I mean, that's been a target in past elections, pre-technology. I think it will be a target in this election. But I think that after we get through this cycle of perhaps more destructive uses of AI, I think that people will, and they already have, but I think that the prioritization will be on productive uses of AI and how to counter destructive use of AI. And that may take us getting through what will likely be a rough election, for which I agree with Cody. I'm quite pessimistic about, not in terms of outcome, but in terms of how it's just going to play out. But I think that it will provide a learning opportunity as we learn sort of the different ways that AI can be used, not that they're going to remain static, but we're starting to learn, and then how do we respond? And I'm hoping that this will at least provide us with information to think about how to respond and how to kind of use AI and other forms of technology to advance our democracy rather than tear it down.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you both so much. Cody Bunting from the University of Maryland, Bertrall Ross from University of Virginia Law School. Thank you both for your terrific contributions. Much appreciated. A lot of food for thought. I am confident that this conversation will find its way into various classrooms, hopefully. Thank you to our attendees for coming and bringing your curiosity and questions. Big thanks to the NYU Institute for Public Knowledge, and big thanks to the Karsh Institute of Democracy for sponsoring the series. We will be back on March 28th with Co-opting AI Crime. In the meantime, please do follow up with the work that our wonderful panelists are doing. You can find them both online. They're visible with all the great stuff they do. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night, and I will see you in about a month, hopefully. Take good care.